Sure. Oh, got the recording note there. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining tonight. And Matt, thanks for hosting this and inviting me to speak with you all. Yeah, so I'll share my screen in a minute. And I just want to offer to people that if you have questions as I'm going through the presentation, feel free to do the little raise your hand symbol or type it in the chat. And, I'm happy to answer questions as I go as well. We can make it a little bit more casual tonight. All right, let me share my screen, get that going. And I've got presentation up. All right, there we go.
I see it. Looks good.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so as Matt introduced, my name is Sarah Janesco, and I am an archaeologist with the Maryland Department of Transportation. And I've been with them for about a year, and the majority of the work that I've been doing has been focused on several sites related to Harriet Tubman's early life in Dorchester County on the Eastern Shore. So that's what I'll be talking about tonight. So it was a little bit challenging putting this presentation together because there is so much history, there's so much good information about these projects that we've been working on. And it's kind of hard to pick a direction to go and what to share with you all. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of different sites that were really important sites for Harriet Tubman as a young girl in the town in Dorchester County near Cambridge and Church Creek and Bucktown as well. So archaeologically, we've been investigating a site on the Anthony Thompson farm, which is the blue star on the map. And we have some documentary records and some other evidence that we think points to this as Harriet Tubman's birthplace. And then Ben Ross's house, which was also on the Thompson farm. Her father lived down by the Blackwater River, and that is the Green Star. And then sort of across the way is the Brodess farm, where Harriet Tubman lived during a few years in her childhood as a young girl. So we'll start with talking about Ben Ross, her father. He was a timber foreman for Anthony Thompson. So he was enslaved by Thompson for most of his life and was finally freed in 1840 after Thompson's death. And we see several life markers for Ben Ross. One of which was when he and Rit Green began their family and started having children in 1808. And this was sort of marked as well by let me back up a second. So what else do we know about Ben Ross? We know that he was a timber foreman, and we also, as I'll talk about, know that he lived by the Blackwater River near a landing. And so he had responsibilities managing Anthony Thompson's timber operation. And so that was his main export, and was clearing the land, cutting it for cordwood, for fuel, but also for timber, for shipbuilding and other purposes. And so that would have been transported out the Blackwater River and to different ports on the Eastern Shore, and also to places like Annapolis and Baltimore as well. And so Ben Ross had a good deal of responsibility on the farm as well. And so, I think that speaks to his role as a leader and demonstrating some of these characteristics that we see Harriet Tubman illustrating when she comes back to Maryland, 13 different trips to help free her family and the other families that were enslaved in this area in that time. So we know he was a leader and demonstrated those qualities. And we also have record of him in the 1840s and 50s purchasing others' freedom. There were two people from families in the area who he freed, purchased their freedom. And he also purchased the freedom for his wife, Ritt Green, as well. And so we can kind of see these qualities of resistance to slavery, being strategic in some of the ways that he goes about that as well. And I think that's something else that he probably passed on to Harriet as well. And when we talk about slavery, we're talking about a landscape where, especially in Cambridge at this time, we had free and enslaved African-American families sort of in a network across these towns and different farms. And so their lives were sort of necessarily intertwined with the white landowning farmers who enslaved a number of people in this area. And so when we see sort of these markers or shifts in people's lives, sometimes that's also marked by like land sales and deaths of the farmers or planters, different marriages and unions and things like that. So all of these are kind of markers of how people are sort of moving across the land. And we see that with the Ross family. So for instance, Ben is enslaved by Anthony Thompson. And when Thompson marries Mary Brodess, she has in trust all of the estate from her former husband, her late husband. And so she brings to Anthony Thompson's farm the people who are enslaved by her, one of whom is Ritt Green, Harriet Tubman's mother. And so we see this is, the possible meeting of Ben Ross and Ritt Green on the Thompson farm. And one of the reasons why we think this is probably where Harriet Tubman was born. Harriet Tubman lives with her father in like the 1830s and 40s. And she would have been in her teenage years at that point. But before that, we see another instance of sort of this movement and separation of families and sort of this condition of being enslaved by different people, where Harriet Tubman, then known as Minty Ross, she was born Araminta Ross. She and her mother and her siblings moved to the Brodess farm in Bucktown. And that was because Edward Brodess, Mary Brodess's son, finally came of age and was able to sort of take on the estate and brought the people who he enslaved with him to his farm. And so we see Harriet and her mother and her siblings being separated from her father at that period at a young age. All right. So one of the pieces of this project, sort of the start of this whole project, was finding where Ben Ross lived. And we have evidence of his home place in the documentary record. So in Anthony Thompson's will, he talks about providing Ben with 10 acres of land around his farm to cut timber and to provide for Anthony Thompson's farm in the same. And he notes that this 10 acres is to be laid out around his house, binding with the road on the west side. And so The road being to the west of Ben's house, we know that Ben probably lives on the east side of the road. I don't know about everyone else, but the pollen has been getting to me recently.
It's the worst. It's because it got so hot so quickly and it's been so
Yeah.
dry. Yeah, I get it. The struggle is real.
So I'm thankful that I don't have it quite as bad as others, but yeah, definitely getting the dryness. So here we have some documentary evidence of where Ben Ross might have lived on the Anthony Thompson farm. And so we go to some other documentary evidence, right? Part of what we do with archaeology and what I love about historical archaeology is that we can use many different kinds of data to back up sort of what we're finding and different modes of evidence, right? So we have two other deeds that talk about, quote, Old Ben's home place on the road leading to the Blackwater River by Thompson's farm. And so these are, again, these deeds are actually using Ben Ross's house as like a marker for laying out where this land is that they're talking about in the deed. So we see that this is a well-known place on a road down by the Blackwater River. And so what road are we talking about here? Well, my colleagues who were doing some of this historical research found the historic Harrisville Road map or plan for the road that was created about 1817 and commissioned, about that time, a couple years, give or take. And so we see this historic map on the left, and they were able to overlay that onto a current map. And the road actually matches up fairly well, meaning it hasn't changed a whole lot in 200 years, which is a little bit remarkable, but at the same time, on a farm this remote in Dorchester County, I guess you're not expecting a whole lot to change geographically and physically like this. So we have Thompson's farm sort of at the top of the road or like in the middle there on the map, you can see. And then down at the bottom is the Blackwater River, where there's a landing there. And Thompson owns the landing. And he was one of the financiers of the road. Him and several other of the farmers along that road, his neighbors, went in together to build this road so that they can get their commercial, their timber and goods and other things that they're producing down to the landing so that they can be shipped out to other ports a little bit easier. And so this is definitely an economic investment for Thompson. But it's also, on the other hand, another route and way in which the people enslaved on his farm and working for Thompson can sort of get other access and information and communicate with other people along this sort of economic route as well. And this is a picture of what the road looks like today. You can kind of see it's kept up a little bit, but you've got the deep ditches on either side. It gets very swampy. This area in like the early 1800s, as I mentioned, they were clear cutting this for timber. And so much of the tall trees that you see today probably would not have been there. So that, what I just showed you was the 18 teens survey of Harrisville Road. And in 2021, archaeologists did a very different kind of survey of the road, which involved digging thousands of holes along the road to try and find archaeological evidence of where Ben's house might have been along this road. And we had some clues, and we were sort of getting closer and closer. And you can see the soil is very wet. It's very hard to screen this. And so it was a challenging part of the survey. I heard I hadn't come on until after that part. No, just kidding.
How
But
convenient.
that, yeah, how convenient, Sarah. But the results of this survey up and down the Harrisville Road resulted in one location that yielded a little moving picture there, that yielded artifacts that dated to the early 1800s. There were several other spots where artifacts were coming up, but they were like early 20th century, a little bit later in time period. And we know that Ben Ross was down there the like first half of the 1800s. So this one location was turning up just a few artifacts, but it was just enough to hint at that was the location of where his house was. It also happened to match the description of the archival records. It was down by the Blackwater River, near where the landing would have been, and to the east side of the road. So excavations ensued in 2021 and 2022. We went back and opened up test units. So the nice square units that you often think of when you think of archaeological excavation. And we were getting more and more artifacts that dated to the time period, the first half of the 1800s. And in 2022, we also uncovered a shallow brick feature. And as you can kind of see in these pictures, it kind of takes a little corner there and sort of gets a little crumbly. And we know that this is sort of like a foundation for some kind of lightweight structure. This isn't going to be a foundation for a house. It's only 1 brick wide, so it's not going to support anything really hefty or heavy duty here. And we're, positing that this area of the foundation that's kind of crumbled and the bricks have been skewed a little bit was likely a threshold or a place that would have been stepped on over and over repeatedly and had more use and wear over time. And that's why it's, the remnants of the brick are still there, but they're kind of crushed up like that. So one of the less glamorous theories is that possibly this is a foundation for a privy, in which case another house structure would probably be very close by. Another working theory that we have about this brick feature is that it might be sort of a lightweight, like front porch or a stoop or something that led into a larger, a more hefty sort of dwelling. And so these are some examples of the kinds of houses that would have been around at this time. You can see they use like brick piers, wooden posts, and other sorts of frames for like a front porch area. So it's possible that this brick feature indicates that there's more of a structure to find very close by. And so we're actually going out to this location in a couple of weeks to open up a couple more test units and see if we can't better identify the structures and other features that are out there. So I'm excited about that. So here are some of the artifacts that we've been finding at the Ben Ross site. Artifacts like these can help us date the site. And it also gives us a glimpse into some of the everyday objects that would have been in their house and what he would have had around him in the household. And so on the left is a picture of a drawer pull that was found during the excavations last year. And it matches very closely in style and design of this example that dates to about 1848. That example is from the Winterthur Museum. And below that is kind of a really, I don't know, I found it really exciting. This was a spoon that we found just from last month when we were doing a metal detection survey at the site to kind of gain some more information. And you can see it's kind of beat up. It's not in the best shape, but that's kind of what you might expect for a spoon that's been in the ground for 200 years. And we see on the handle of the spoon, there's a maker's mark actually of J. Irwin. And John Irwin was a silversmith in Baltimore, Maryland in 1800 to 1820. And these are his maker's marks. So this was a pretty cool discovery. You know, you don't always find the artifacts that have a date stamped on them or a good, nice, clear maker's mark that you can readily identify who made it and when. But this is one of those artifacts, and it's pretty cool because it's also a very personal artifact that somebody was eating off of, you know, eating with, and this would have been in their possession. So it's kind of a special find. Some other artifacts that we find, and most of the datable artifacts are ceramics. These are mostly European imported, but some ceramics were American made at the time. But based on the style and manufacturing and the designs and decorations and when those were in production, we can pretty easily date sites with these or get a date range at least, you know. So the green edgeware that you see is impressed, and those dishes usually date from 1800 to 1830. And then we've got on the right side some examples of cut sponge decorated ceramics. So kind of like the name implies, they're cutting a design in the sponge and stamping it. And below those two examples are what the artifacts kind of look like in a more complete fashion. We also found just a few fragments of tobacco pipe bowls and stems. In one of Harriet Tubman's recollections that she shared, she, I believe, talks about her mother. She remembers her mother smoking a pipe, and you know, it's kind of neat to have that anecdotal evidence from you know, something that Harriet Tubman remembers about her mom, and finding this at the place where her father lived as well. But these are also very common on archaeological sites at this time. You find a lot of pipe stems. Anyone who's volunteered in a lab or, you know, helped screen some artifacts on a public site, you kind of know that those can be kind of ubiquitous. Another really cool opportunity that I got with this project was to X-ray the metal artifacts that we were finding from the Ben Ross house. And as you can see in the photo on the far left, it just kind of looks like an iron blob. It's corroded. You can't tell what it is. But with X-ray, we can identify the shape of what the original object was. In this case, you can see it's a very sort of ghostly image of a buckle. And this kind of a buckle would have been used for some sort of strap, maybe on a horse, or with like a bag or a satchel or something like that, that sort of thing. X-raying is not just useful for identification of artifacts, but it also helps curators understand how much of an artifact remains intact. So we're talking about the integrity and sort of the stability and the structure of the artifact. And with iron, all the corrosion comes from the inside out, which is why they just look like blobs. And so in this image, you can see that the buckle is kind of ghostly, and that means that it's an indication that there's not very much of the buckle that remains. So if we tried to remove all the corrosion and try to preserve the buckle and find it in its original form, it would just kind of disintegrate and not be there. So there's not very much left of this buckle to preserve, unfortunately. Here's another example of some artifacts. These are a little bit more readily identifiable as horseshoes, but again, in the X-ray, you can very clearly see the holes in the horseshoes. You can tell the shape and size a little bit better. And again, you can identify the integrity of these materials and what might be beneficial for preserving and conserving. Any questions so far? Everybody's soaking it in. Okay, so so to kind of recap, we've got the Ben Ross site, which we found at the end of Harrisville Road near the Blackwater River. And this was still part of Anthony Thompson's farm. Thompson owned like several thousand acres at one point. He acquired a lot of land. He did a lot of clear cutting. I mean, that was his business. He needed to purchase a lot of land to harvest the trees, and so he ended up with a lot. But his Anthony Thompson's house was sort of in the center, sort of where that label is on the map is where we think what was labeled as the Mansion Farm house was built. And so that was where he lived on his property. This is an image of what the structure looked like in about 1917. It was built in around 1810-ish. And we know that a little bit from some records and also some of the description of the house and the style in which it was built. And unfortunately, in the 1980s, the house was completely razed, so it no longer exists on the landscape.
What does the inscription say on that photo? Is there something about a birthday?
Yeah, I don't actually know. I've looked at that too. I think it says something home on my birthday. And so this photo was actually provided to us. I don't have the names correct, so I don't want to get that wrong, but provided to us by a family member of somebody who lived in this house. I think in the 20th century, so in more recent times. And so they had a picture of this.
God,
So
thank you.
Part of a family record, which explains the birthday note, I suppose. So, well, let me back up one. So when we're thinking about landscapes and we're thinking about how a farmer or a planter would have laid out things on their on their farm to project their status, right? We know that Anthony Thompson, he had this big timber industry. He invested in the road that led there. He also invested in the canal that went from the Blackwater River up to one of the other port towns. And so he was sort of, he was a big name in the town. He was investing a lot. He, wanted to display this wealth in a number of ways. One of which is usually the construction of, an elaborate house. And so this was his house. But somewhere else on his landscape, he needed to house the enslaved workers who worked for him and whom, he often hired out to other people for work as well. And so we were trying to identify where that the other housing and other farm structures would have been. And so more shovel testing or more, digging of hundreds of holes all over this property. And this is all part of private property today. And so getting permission to dig there and an agreement with the owners first. And that led us to another spot on the Thompson farm. Historically, the Thompson farm. We dig it. This is before my time with MDOT, but Dr. Julie Shablinsky, who runs the Cultural Resources Program at MDOT and leads this program, they had started a couple of excavation units. They were kind of finding some stuff, but needed some more confirmation, and so. Again, kind of what I said before about different data methods and corroborating information. This was one of those things that we decided to do. And so this is a geophysical survey, and it's non-invasive. It doesn't involve digging, but usually the results we end up digging. But this is Tim Horsley, who we hired to conduct this geophysical survey. And so he's running this machine over top of the surface of the ground, and it's measuring certain magnetic responses that it's penetrating the ground with and receiving the signals. And from that information, it can tell if there's been some kind of ground disturbance or burning event or something like this that's happened below ground. And so with his data, he produces these kinds of maps. They're very colorful, and the colors indicate how far below the surface we're looking at for these different kinds of anomalies, we call them. And very blatant, smack dab in the middle of this image is what? A house. It's a very, rectangular structure. It kind of screams at you. There's something here. And the funny thing is that you can kind of see the outline of excavation units that had already been dug over top of this area around the house. The limiting factor in the excavation here and why they didn't, the team didn't find anything at first was because the water table was so high that it was filling in the unit and they weren't even like a foot below the surface. And so you can't dig your unit if it's constantly being filled in with water. So they had to stop the excavations at that point. But it meant that we went back to this spot and continued to dig and found the remnants of the foundation of the house and several other features related to the house as well. Sometimes with houses, you can find, I'll say this, we didn't find an intact foundation. We found what was left of the foundation after it had been, what we say, robbed out, or, at the end of the house's life, when nobody was living in it any longer, they dismantled it and reused brick and other materials from these houses, and then sort of raised it from the ground. And so what we're seeing in this picture, sort of in the bottom of the picture in this unit, is all of the rubble, the broken pieces of brick and everything that they tossed back into the foundation trench after they had excavated all the brick that they wanted from it. The other side of the unit is, you'll probably notice it's like this black sort of charcoal-y layer, and that's actually sitting on top of intact brick. And so this was a really exciting feature, and it likely, as we're sort of piecing all the clues together, we're understanding that this was the side of the house with the chimney. And so this was left over from the chimney foundation, and the hearth, which would have been above that, above ground. So what we're finding in this charcoal layer are a lot of different kinds of artifacts. We're seeing these buttons, mending artifacts like the straight pin and the thimbles. We're also finding pieces of ceramic dishes, food remains, oyster shell. We're finding domestic animals like pig mandibles. We're also seeing cow, and as well as animals that they would have hunted and trapped for, raccoon and muskrat and fish and oyster as well. So here's another angle and sort of another, we're a little bit further along in the excavation in this photo, but you can see a little bit more clearly the intact brick here, and sort of where that would have been located on the geophysical map of this house structure. We continued to dig this unit down layer by layer, and underneath of the charcoal layer was another layer of fill. And so this to us indicated that there was, a cellar at one time in this house. And we weren't expecting to find anything below that, because below that last layer of fill was the subsoil, which is devoid of any cultural materials, except that we did find something. And it was a pretty remarkable discovery. There was this group of artifacts, this glass decanter stopper, ceramic creamware plates, plate shards, and some nails that were set together in this one area. There were no other artifacts around it. There was no evidence in the stratigraphy that it was dug out and placed there. It was placed there, and then this layer of fill was placed on top. So it's this really curious cache of artifacts. And we all kind of knew this was something special, and we wanted to continue to excavate around it very carefully. And you can see that it happens to be, the last week that we're out there digging, of course, and it's also in our excavation wall, our unit wall. So we have to excavate the other side of the unit to be able to remove and, sort of identify the full context of the materials here. But this is an image. We had them on display recently, and these are the artifacts cleaned up and sort of in an attempt to recreate this without all the dirt around it. And we see, as you can see, we have in the upper right corner, we have a brass button. It's upside down. So what you're seeing is the loop back. We have creamware plate sherds that actually mend together. And we have the glass decanter stopper. We have the blue painted pearlware shard. It's probably from a teacup. And then we have some brick and oyster shell, as well as the nails that have corroded. And that was one of the artifacts that we x-rayed as well. And so we could see that those were two different nails. And together, these represent an African-American cache or a religious bundle. And when in archaeology, what we're looking at are patterns, right? We're looking for social patterns. There's a lot of variation in what we do as humans, right? We're all individuals. We have different ways of doing things and thinking about the world. But when we start to see patterns, we know that there's something bigger going on here, right? Than just somebody decided to put some artifacts together in this one spot in the cellar of this house. And when we look at other caches like this, we can see that these are coming from known contexts where African-American families lived or worked. This particular cache, this photo is from the 1980s after this cache was excavated from the Charles Carroll House in Annapolis. And we can see some similar artifacts here. We have the crystals, the buttons, round objects like buttons and coins. We have metal, sort of sharp objects like the straight pins there. And we also have blue painted ceramic as well. And so,
Sarah, I get the feeling that you're using the word religious in a slightly specialized way. Can you talk a little bit about that word, religious bundle?
sure. So there are many other people who are more versed in this than I am, but what I know and from what I've learned as a University of Maryland student is this. I'm kind of also using sort of bundle and cache interchangeably as well. And really what the point of this is to signify that this is a group of artifacts that was very deliberately placed in a setting that was meant to provide safety and protection for those who put it there and for those living in that space. And a lot of the symbols of the items that have been used can be linked to West African religious practices and beliefs and symbology. And so in talking about religion and spirituality, we're talking about practices that are passed down from generation to generation, from people of African descent, from people who were brought from Africa, and sharing that with their descendant, their relatives, yeah. And so we're talking about religion and spirituality as it's been passed down. And so we see this sort of mix of West African religion and these sorts of practices, sometimes alongside very Christian beliefs and religious practices as well. And so it's kind of a mix.
Neat. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah. So in sort of thinking about this and thinking about these patterns and what we're seeing and what the evidence is, you know, what we don't know is who exactly put this here. We don't know what the items meant to the person who put them there or what their specific reasoning was. Like I mentioned, these are sort of the individualities that we don't know and we will probably never know. But from the archaeological record, from the patterns that we see, we can link this to probably somebody of African descent put this here, probably because they were living or working in this building, and were seeking some sort of protection in this space. So this image is a bird's eye view of the open excavation units at the end of our season last year. You can see on sort of the left side there, the intact brick chimney foundation that I mentioned earlier. And on the right side, it's not fully excavated, but you can kind of see a little bit of a darker stain in that top right unit where the foundation, the robbed out foundation was. And so if we overlay Horsley's geophysical map on this, hopefully this gives you a better visualization of the size and structure of this house. And so based on what we're finding in our units, this is sort of a theory about how we think this house was constructed and laid out. The dark blue around the outside is the foundation. The two light blue lines on the middle would probably have been like a center hall passage through the house, with the kitchen and cooking room and dining room on the left side where the chimney was. And then another separate room on the right. This sort of orange square above in the top of the structure might have been like an outside access to the cellar. We're not sure quite where that was, but there was evidence of like a pier and a post hole sort of in that area as well. And then the yellow area, we haven't excavated there yet. So it's possible that, maybe that is sort of a yard area, or maybe a porch was there as well. And so we're starting to put together clues about how the structure was built, and hopefully trying to answer by the end of this all who might have lived there as well.
There's a question in the chat from one of our club members. Sarah, do you see that?
Yeah. Can you speak to what artifacts are more common in spiritual caches versus artifacts that are not commonly found? That's a question I'd probably have to get back to you on. The example that I provided with the cache from the Charles Carroll house, those symbols, things that represent like glass or crystals, those are some of the objects that you might find. Round objects, buttons and coins, bottle bases put in the ground, wheels or any kind of iron objects like that. These are some of the reoccurring symbols that we're seeing in a lot of the different spiritual caches, especially the ones coming from Annapolis and in other Maryland sites as well. I don't know that I could speak to items that aren't found in caches, but I hope that kind of helps to answer your question. These are, those, to my understanding, caches, artifacts that were chosen for caches had those sorts of elements to them, representing sort of glass or something you can see through, iron objects, round objects. And there's a lot of research into sort of what these mean. But I can't speak to that sort of off the top of my head right now. Thanks, Ethan. I see another question as well. What are the logistics of what you've been doing? Are these federal, state, private properties? How do you approach the owners? Where do all of these neat artifacts end up? Private hands, museums, etc. Yeah, good question. Good question, Richard. So as MDOT, sorry, I have a cat coming through. So we have, it's kind of, so we have a site on federal property. We have a site on private property. Actually 2 sites on private property. And so there, sometimes you need permits to be able to dig on federal lands. You have to contact whoever the property owners are to get permission for private property. And as long as they're in agreement, you know, you have an agreement about what you'll be doing, when you'll be there, those kinds of things. You're usually good to go about that. The reason why MDOT is doing this project is because it's linked to the Harriet Tubman byway, which is the byway that goes basically up and down the Eastern Shore. There's a number of different sites that are listed on the byway, and so we're hoping to add information for that sort of public facing side of things. We've also been partnering with Fish and Wildlife, DNR, Department of Natural Resources, who also operates the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Visitor Center near Cambridge as well. And the artifacts, again, for private property, the artifacts, we just ask if the property owner would like to basically donate those to the state, and they go to the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab. And then we sort of do the same thing and work on an agreement with state and federal landowners as well. And there's just a different sort of mechanism for getting those collections into the MAC lab. But because we're digging in Maryland and all of our sort of resources are coming from Maryland, we generally try to give these collections to the MAC lab so that they can be further researched and studied and looked at by other people, other stakeholders, and people who want to use these collections for research. The cats always get lots of comments. We know the Blackwater grounds are flooding due to sea level rise. How can this affect your project since it is so close? Yes. As I mentioned, some of our field work is affected by really high water tables. We also know that the shoreline along the Blackwater River is not the same as it was 200 years ago. I think a lot of that is due to sort of erosion of the banks and also some of like the silting in of the river. Higher salinities of the water is causing more of the trees along the river to die off as well. So I think there's, I don't know what the time frame would be, but we're certainly trying to assess these resources now before they are impacted by sea level rise. So that is, sort of one aspect of what sort of prompted us to do this. Yeah, cool. Thanks for the questions. These are great. Okay, cool. Let me move on. Okay, so I was talking about the structure of the house and sort of what we know about how it might have been constructed and how it looked based on the archaeology and what we're finding. And this is an example of another house, a historic house that's been recorded in on the Eastern Shore. And you can see that it's got this brick foundation. Likely there was some kind of cellar or crawl space underneath of that, but what we're seeing is the steps up to the front door, and the the floor would have been a little bit raised off of the ground. It's mostly made of timbers and wood, except for the chimney. This one had, as you can kind of see, one side of the building is completely made of brick. We haven't found that much evidence of brick on the site. We think it was probably just the brick chimney on the north side of the house. We also know that, where this house was located on the Thompson farm, it probably would have been built in this way to appear a little bit more grand than it actually was from a distance. So if you're pulling up to the Anthony Thompson mansion house and you're very impressed by his architecture, and then you sort of look down the lane at some of his other farm buildings, you can kind of see that there's this other structure that appears nice from a distance, and it probably wasn't as well constructed and as nicely finished, probably wouldn't have had dormers like this example does. So little things like that. So our big question now that we're trying to answer is who lived in this house? And we kind of think it's a little bit complicated. There's a couple different theories that we've posed, and it's possible that there were different people living in this house at different points in time throughout the, sort of the history of Anthony Thompson, and even after his death, when this guy named John Parker came in and started managing his farm for him after his death. And so it's possible that this was maybe a temporary house for Thompson while he built the mansion house where he lived eventually. He could have lived there sort of temporarily in like the 1800s while his other house was being built. It's also possible that this was a white overseer's quarters. Kind of like I mentioned, this house was sort of in the distance. It was far enough away, but just in sight of Anthony Thompson's main house. And this sort of is, an indication of status of whoever lived here on this house in this quarters. Somebody who would have had a little bit more responsibility on the Anthony Thompson farm, but not as wealthy and high status as the farmer himself. And then there's also a possibility that, sort of given the information we have and the evidence that there was likely somebody of African descent living in this space at one point, that possibly towards the end of when this house was occupied, it might have been lived in by somebody like Jerry Menoke, who was also mentioned and called outright in Anthony Thompson's will. Also provided 10 acres of land on the Thompson farm for the privileges of cutting timber and the use of those 10 acres. And so we can kind of see that this person, Jerry Menoke, was sort of at a similar level as Ben Ross, and his position within Anthony Thompson's will and his sort of estate and his economic strategy for continuing the operation of his farm and his timber industry even after his death. He needed somebody to run it, and none of his sons were interested in doing so. So he has these two people who he's enslaved for a long period of time, and he's giving them some land on his farm so that they can kind of continue these operations after his death. And so it's possible that somebody like Jerry might have lived in that house sort of towards the end of that occupation. And we think that that house was likely like unoccupied, and sort of the materials scavenged in the like mid 1800s as well. So to kind of sum up these sites, we've got the farm where Harriet Tubman was born and her father's house on this side of the river. And then the Brodess farm, which I didn't talk too much about. I sort of ran out of time there, but we did do some recent work at the historically Brodess farm area. We did some metal detecting surveys about a month ago and found a whole host of artifacts. We mapped the location of all of those artifacts that we hit with the metal detectors, and we're working to put together some really informative maps about what kinds of artifacts were found where on the farm, and what that tells us about where there might have been other houses for enslaved workers or other people who were on the Brodess farm as well. And so we're continuing to do some investigation over there. And kind of coming back to something that I mentioned in the very beginning is these sites where her father lived and the Brodess farm, they're about 10 to 15 miles apart. And so what we're seeing here is a network of families, a network of different people, African-American families, both free and enslaved, and how they kept communication, how they kept ties with each other and bonds, even in sort of the face of removal of family members, both in terms of where they were living on different farms and also being sold most of the time illegally to other people. And so we're really seeing sort of the resilience of this community, the ways that they're resisting these systems of oppression and slavery, and ultimately Harriet Tubman's eventual escape of freedom and her coming back to these places at great risk to herself to be able to save her other family members and the other people, the other families that were part of her network in this area. And just a quick acknowledgement to all of the people and partners who have worked with MDOT on this project over the last couple of years. Including, I will say, two of the Tubman and Ross descendants, Tina Wyatt and Douglas Mitchell. Both of them have been out to the sites to visit and sort of see what we're doing, what we're excavating, what we're finding, and providing some input and feedback and their own sort of journey with us in these archaeological excavations as well. And we do have some information out on both a Facebook page and an Instagram with some of our finds and some more explanation about some of these things that I talked about as well in the presentation. So check those out. Any other questions?
Thank you, Sarah.
I did go for a really long time. I apologize. Like I said, it's hard to distill all of this information. There's so much that
I think we could have probably easily covered that in a lot more detail. It is what it is. There's another hand up. I think we have another question coming in, if you don't mind staying a little longer.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just a very general thing. I'm kind of flabbergasted that the Maryland Department of Transportation does such things. I never would have discovered that. and the neat things you've gotten to do in a year, this is the kind of stuff that a amateur archaeologist loves to do. Go out and find artifacts like this that are of importance. What is there a theory by the Department of Transportation as to why they have a section that does these kind of things rather than pour asphalt? Or do they do other similar kind of things? It's kind of interesting that they would be doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of people are kind of surprised that there's archaeologists in MDOT too. And so you're not alone in that question. But this, yeah, it's a pretty unique and special program. I'm honored to be a part of it. And it's a stewardship program, again, sort of tying in these transportation routes, the Harriet Tubman Byway. We did some other excavations recently on a historic furnace that's sort of part of a historic route, and other sites that are significant specifically to African American history, and the Network to Freedom Trail, things like this that are sort of state and federal programs that aim to recognize some of these histories that have gone untold for many years.
Yeah, thank you. That's excellent. I'm glad that's being done. Thanks.
I appreciate that.
Thank you, Sarah. Is that it for questions? I agree. It's great work, important, fascinating. Thank you for doing the work, and thank you also for taking the time to come and talk to us about it.
You're welcome.
Privilege to have you.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for joining us tonight and for your great questions. I appreciate it.